Welcome back, everyone, to our third lecture in the series of lectures on progressivism for Social 30. Just going to flip the screen here and we'll get started. So last time we were together, we were looking at the Great Depression and the New Deal and how that kind of shifts society. And so what we see is in the Great Depression, all of these changes take place, and it's not actually these changes and these laws in the New Deal and then in the United States and then a sister deal typically in Canada there that pulls us out of the Depression. It's World War II that pulls us out of the Depression itself. But so today what our focus is going to be is the effects of this on liberalism and democracies around the world. So what begins to happen is you start to see people questioning this wisdom of this laissez-faire, free market, classical liberal society and capitalism in general. And so what we see is in Canada specifically, we see this shift towards a mixed market economy, right? This idea of a combination of government intervention and public ownership of industry and financial institutions and healthcare and education, right? So this significant shift away from classical liberal society towards a modern mixed economy with the belief that the government should take a greater role to prevent the extreme fluctuations in the business cycle and prevent these massive depressions from happening or lessening the effects of these recessions and depressions, right? Providing stability. So what we see, right, if we look at this economic spectrum, right, before the Depression, you saw society. There were a few rules, but not a lot in terms of government intervention. But then during the Depression, right, we start to really shift to the left, right, towards these ideas of socialism. After the Depression, starting to pull out, but not going quite as far as over here, right, because we still do have government intervention in our economy. So what we're going to look at is this idea of the post-war consensus. We'll talk about what that means, the time period, and what transpires. So the post-war consensus refers to a period in politics from the end of World War I until the end of the 1970s. Because what we see in countries like Canada, the US, Britain, other democratic states, we see changes in the role of the state, right? The role government plays in the lives of people and the lives of business. And so we see the growth of various pieces and principles of liberalism and how that impacts society, right? This idea of collective interest that is growing, the idea that the profit motive is important for some but not important for all. But what we see is this idea of collective interest begin to expand through time. This occurs throughout the world, related to trade, cooperation, right, and the rules that govern how all of that is going to happen. So during this post-war consensus, right, it doesn't all happen at once. This happens over time. We see the development of a lot of different programs that come to form what's called a social safety net, right? The idea of employment insurance. We still see that today. The idea of assistance for the elderly. This comes in right now in Canada in a payment called old age security. Old age security. If you're at a certain age, doesn't matter how much money you've made over your lifetime, you get old age security, and this is how much it is. Childcare, right? Childcare benefits, childcare subsidies, various points in time, and how that works depending on maybe how much income you have and all of that. The introduction of universal healthcare, right? In Canada, we are very fortunate to have public healthcare where it does not cost you anything to seek medical assistance. Something very important in the times we're living in right now. And these programs in this post-war consensus are made possible by different acts at different times. The National Insurance Act, the National Assistance Act, and the National Health Service Act. Now, over time, over the last number of years, these acts have been amended over time to meet the different needs of our societies over time. But these ideas, right, that we take for granted now weren't always there. So post-war economy in Canada, what does that look like? Okay, so after World War II, the Canadian government starts creating and strengthening social programs, right? We saw the impacts during the Great Depression, and so they're going to expand those programs, keep some, expand them, ditch others. But legislation introduced ideas of unemployment insurance or employment insurance. This idea of a family allowance that helped try to ease the burden of caring for children. Over the course of time, that family allowance has shape-shifted in terms of what it's called, if you owe taxes on it, if you don't, how much you get, depending on your income. But those were introductions post-Second World War. Ultimately speaking, all of these pieces of legislation and programs that get put into place are moving us towards the development of a welfare state, where the state plays a role in protecting people and the economy. Okay, so a balance, right? This idea of equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, because choices will still dictate equality of outcome or dictate the outcome. But this idea that everybody has the basic opportunity or equality of opportunity to access basic social programs to make sure their needs are met. Some of these programs are the ones that you see there on the right. Universal healthcare, something we for sure take for granted, but man, am I ever glad that we have, right? If you need to see a doctor, right, you can see one without charge in Canada if you're a Canadian citizen, right? That idea that you don't have to pay. Canada Pension Plan, CPP. We pay into that, and once you get moving into adulthood, you'll be paying a pension plan on every one of your checks moving forward, right? That idea that when you are at a certain age, so I believe it's mid-60s right now, you can collect CPP. And the amount that you will receive in return is based on how much you put into it over time. Old age security, I already mentioned. The Foreign Investment Review Agency, right? This idea promoting foreign investment in the Canadian economy. We won't get into that today. The Canadian Radio and Television Commission, the CRTC, you would have been introduced to that in Social 10. This is a post-war consensus idea, trying to protect Canadian radio and television programming, right? Looking at airtime and other things. The Atomic Energy of Canada, right? This idea of government control for uses of nuclear energy. Now we're going to fast forward a couple of decades into the 1970s and an economic crisis. Okay? And we're looking at the Middle East. Okay? So 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. The US and Western Europe supported Israel during this conflict. One of the other stakeholders in this conflict was OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Basically, OPEC is, and they're in the news right now related to a price war with Russia. They reduced oil production and they reduced how much they were exporting. As a result, right now they're flooding the market, which is dropping our price. But when they were restricting the amount, when they were curtailing the amount into the market, this caused the price of oil to quadruple. And the chain reaction of that is in the United States and Canada and other places, you saw gas shortages and rationing specifically in the United States. This has a massive effect, right? Because gas is increasing in price. Therefore, goods are more expensive, right? It's causing inflation to rise, right? It costs more to ship those goods. It costs more to transport them. And so what you see when inflation increases, right? What we see down here in the 1970s is a slowdown in the economy. When a recession and high inflation occur at the same time, this is something known as stagflation. As a result of this stagflation, governments in many Western countries tried to figure out that the cost of maintaining programs of the welfare state was rising, right? Because it was costing people more money to live. So the cost is increasing, but the slowdown means that the government is actually collecting less tax revenue, right? Much like right now. This is leading to a shift in thinking in these countries in the 1970s and 1980s. This leads us into this idea of monetarism. And we're going to talk about what that means and the impacts of this in liberal democracies. Monetarism, okay, alternates, kind of goes back and forth between interventionism and the free market economy. Okay? Monetarism itself reflects the swing of the pendulum back towards the classical liberal principles of the US and the UK prior to the wars. In that, right, they wanting to pull back on some of that intervention by governments, pull back some of the supports of the welfare state, potentially. Right? Right? Control of a country's money supply. Right? If you control the money, you can encourage economic growth. Looking at interest, by regulating the interest rate. So right now, the Bank of Canada, in our contemporary crisis, has dropped the interest rate several times in the last month in hopes of stimulating people to borrow and then invest in the economy in some capacity. Okay? So control of a government's money supply is best means to encourage growth, limit unemployment and inflation, and regulate the interest rate. Now, you would have been introduced in Social 10 to two guys named Friedman and Hayek in some capacity, but you likely don't remember them. But it's okay. We're going to talk about them at length in our next series of lectures into the next couple of weeks. Okay? Friedman and Hayek believed in principles of monetarism. They were neoconservatives in the sense that they wanted to reduce the amount of government intervention in society. Okay? They believed that the free market was the best way to balance supply and demand while maintaining individual freedoms. Okay? This is moving away from those ideas of the New Deal and the post-war consensus, right? Moving away from those Keynesian economic principles. Don't worry, we're going to talk about them in a lecture down the road. Basically moving away from government intervention and back to more classical ideas or neoconservative ideas, as we're going to call them. Okay? Ultimately speaking, okay, what we see is a shift from classical liberalism towards more modern liberalism, and then a little bit back towards this idea of monetarism. Right? We look at intervention of governments during and after the war, looking at the establishment of the mixed market economy like we have in Canada right now, and the various pieces of advice from the different philosophers. And we're going to talk about, we shouldn't even call them philosophers, economists, because most of them are 20th century thinkers at this point, right? Keynes. Right, Keynes's ideas, this idea of government intervention, had been partially accepted. And what we see, depending on political parties in power, we see this kind of back and forth between what they deem as acceptable versus not acceptable in terms of volume of government intervention. So our classical or our economic system today, what does that look like? Right, modern liberalism is where a lot of our democracies fall in some capacity, right? This mixed market economy. And you'll notice, right, we've got a range of countries in here. And you'll notice the United States is closer to a mixed economy than a lot of us come to realize. They are closer to a mixed economy than they are a free market one. Now, their economy is very different than Canada and Sweden and other nations that are a little bit further with a little bit more government intervention and a few more social safety nets, right? The United States is over here, right? They don't have public health care, right, to the same extent that we do. So that pushes them a little bit further to the right, right? Less government intervention, right? You've got Sweden further to the left than Canada and the Netherlands with a tremendous amount of intervention. Okay? And depending on what political party is in power in any country in any given time, where they are on this spectrum might shift just a little bit depending on what programs they may introduce or try to pull back on. Okay? But you'll notice the different types of characteristics, right? Focusing on individual freedom, individual responsibility, limited protection from employees, okay, versus group well-being, those types of ideas. And that's where we're going to stop for today. This week's task, you're looking at the idea and comparing the intervention, government interventions of the 20th century to the 21st century. right? Comparing government intervention during the Great Depression in Canada and the United States to now government intervention in the economy during this COVID crisis. Have a great day, everyone.